Good morning. My name is Angela Bright White, and yes, that's my real name. I have a rhyming name, and I teach middle school, so I figured I might as well go with it. I do teach middle school. I teach 7th and 8th grade social studies at Philadelphia Elementary School in East Tennessee. I did teach 3rd grade for a very long time. I've been pretty much everywhere except 1st grade, which I almost taught until I freaked out and thought, oh, I'm going to screw these kids up, so I need to go somewhere else. So I went to 7th and 8th grade. I have been with Ag in the Classroom for several years. I began just because I grew up on a dairy farm. My parents have let's see, I think we're on the 6th generation of people living on our farm. And we have recently switched over from dairy to beef. I know many of you have probably heard the problems going on in the dairy industry. So when our feed bill was more than the milk check, my dad decided, we had to do something different. So we're in that process. It's been going on for a couple of years. Yes, this is K2. I'm sorry, I do teach 7th and 8th grade, but Chris somehow always puts me with K2 people. So I think he thinks I'm a little bit versatile, so we'll see. And we have several other presenters that will be talking today too that actually teach in K2. The first thing I want to do is just talk to you about some of the activities that I can use in my classroom from Ag in the Classroom. And I think all of these things are pretty adaptable, and I can use them when I'm doing 7th and 8th grade. I use them in our after-school program a lot. I'm the coordinator for that at my school. So these are things that my K2 teachers use. We have a K2 program that the students go to every day, and then our 3 through 8 program for after school, they get a little bit more choice about where they go and what they sign up for. So we're going to start with something that I always like to do with my kids, even the 7th and 8th graders, because I have found that many times our kids do not understand where their food and fiber come from. And I think it is very important as consumers that we understand where those things happen. So I always start out in my STEM classes that I do after school with making butter. And I always ask the kids, hey, do you know where your butter comes from or how to make it? Have you done this at home before? And sometimes I will have kids that say yes. We make this all the time at home. Some don't have a clue. One of my favorite stories is of a 7th grader that I had one time who looked at me and said, "You're making butter today?" And I told him yes. And I handed him his little cup that I use in the room. I get these from our cafeteria manager, and it's just the little cups that you can use to put salad dressing or something like that in. And I handed him his cup, and he had the funniest look on his face. And he said, "What is in there?" And I told him it was whipping cream. And he said, "How are you going to make butter out of milk?" And I said, "Well, how do you make butter?" He said, "Butter comes from pigs." So he was a little confused about where it came from. I gave him a hard time. He happened to be my principal's son. So I gave my principal a hard time too, because his son didn't know where butter came from. But a couple of things about this. In your tub, you have a book called the ABC book, and this is probably my favorite book in the tub. And it has all kinds of different things and activities that you can do with your students. The making butter is simple. There are a couple of things that will make it easier for you, and this is on page 6 of your book if you have that handy. But a couple of things that will make this much simpler for you is, one, be sure you use whipping cream. If you use skim milk, you're going to have that kid shaking for a very long time. So if you have somebody that needs to be busy for a longer period of time, you know, you can give that kid skim milk. But a couple of things just to know is your butter or your cream will turn to butter more quickly if you leave it out and let the whipping cream warm to room temperature. As you're shaking your whipping cream, I suggest that you ask your students to listen to it, because as you're shaking, you're going to hear different sounds. And at one point, you're not going to hear anything. And your kids are going to say, "Ooh, I've already made butter, I'm done." Well, if they continue shaking, then you'll get a thump. And that's what you're going for. When your cup begins to thump, then you have butter, but you're still going to have some liquid. So you'll ask your students to take that and open it up after it begins thumping and look at their pat of butter that will have developed. But then you're going to talk about that byproduct also. Why is there still liquid in your butter? And then you could talk about the different parts and how this would be your whey from your butter or from your milk. And you could talk about Little Miss Muffet and eating her curds and whey, and talk about the different parts. You can talk about the change that occurs when you're making butter, because you're going from a liquid to a solid. And then you can also talk about just the different components of milk itself. I know today, in today's world, you have many different types of milk, and I use milk in quotes there because as I am a dairy farmer's daughter, we don't use almond milk at our house because, you know, I've never seen anybody milk an almond, but I have seen my dad milk cows. So we talk about that, and we talk about the different components and the percentages of fat in our milk. We talk about the protein available in milk, and you can do just a little bit of research. It doesn't take very long, and see those different components of the milk and compare those different things. We also talk about food safety and talk about how milk today, if you're looking at different advertisements and things like that about milk products, if you have milk in your refrigerator, it might say antibiotic free. And that's something new that you see on packaging sometimes. Milk has always been antibiotic free. We have a separate tank in our barn that milk of cows who are being treated with antibiotics is put in, because if for some reason something messes up and it gets into our milk supply, our big tank in our straining room, then that whole tank of milk has to be poured out. If for some reason, and it's very unlikely that it would happen because they test each tank when they pick it up, but if it gets in the tanker truck of milk, then my dad would be liable for the entire tanker truck. So our farmers are doing everything that they absolutely can in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, because that's how they feed their family. That's how I was able to go to school and, you know, not have huge student debt, because my dad was very careful and very, he just made sure that that didn't happen with family's livelihood. So milk is something that you can use with your kids, and there are several different recipes that you can find in our ABC book. Another easy one to do, I'm not going to say easy in this day and time because everything seems to be a little bit harder that we're doing in our classrooms, but on page 27, there is an ice cream in a bag recipe that you can use with students. And again, I've done this with several different classrooms and different age groups. So it's better to be able to do this in a place that you can get messy, because invariably there's going to be water and salt and those kinds of things dripping everywhere. But many of our students have never done this. I mean, it's not something that you do on a Sunday night on the weekends anymore like we did when we were kids. But seeing milk change into ice cream right in front of their eyes is a pretty cool thing for our kids to be doing. I was going to do that today, but then I found a couple of other things that aren't as messy to do. So I will show you a couple of those and just some different books that I've used when talking with our kids about agriculture. One of the activities I used to do when I taught 3rd grade was gardening in a glove. Oops, I've got seeds going everywhere. And we would plant different seeds and watch those grow. And I know we've probably all done that with bean seeds and those kinds of things that grow pretty quickly. But gardening in a glove, you just use a clear glove and you can put cotton balls down in that, and that's where you're going to put your water, and you will wet those. This year in STEM camp, we did this as an activity, and because we were doing it virtually, we found out that many kids pretty much soaked everything, and they had too much water in their glove. And then in a couple of days when we came back and checked them, then you had a little bit of mold and everything growing in there because they pretty much just had too much. So be careful when you're asking your students to wet their cotton balls. And if you're doing it in person, then it's easy to check. But like I said, if you're having to do it virtually, you might have a little bit of stuff messing up as you go. But you put your cotton ball in your fingertips. And then we did 5 different seeds. So you can see different plants growing. And I always try to pick some that are pretty quick to sprout because it gets a little boring if you're just sitting there watching it and it never grows. But in this one I have a pumpkin seed. I have an okra seed. A radish, and a squash seed. I'm not sure if it was zucchini or yellow squash. But I also would have my students label, depending on what grade level I had, what each seed was, so that we can watch that grow. And these we place just in a window of our classroom. And we track, you know, how much they would grow daily. We could track how much difference there was between different kinds of seeds. And then some, if they did really well, we could transplant later on. And depending on what time of year we were doing this, we could transplant them and put them in our school garden. Many times we would just put it in a different cup so they could take it home. And this afternoon when Chris talks to you about the garden grant, you can find that those are really easy to get. It's going to probably be the easiest grant you've ever applied for and know that you're going to get. At that time, I would also use a book called Who Grew My Soup with my students. And this one, we would probably use around Thanksgiving. I used Who Grew My Soup and Stone Soup when we were doing this. And I asked my students to bring in different canned vegetables. And we made vegetable soup in our classroom. And I was really surprised at how many of my students, one, just thought vegetable soup came out of one can with Campbell's. but then also how many had never just tried it. And I was really surprised at how many students would actually try the soup just because they had a hand in making it and they had smelled it cooking all day long in our classroom. So they were very willing to at least try it, which I thought was a win for me, just getting them to try something new. And a lot of the things that we have in this ABC book, you're going to find include food that your students can try. And many times, if it seemed like if I offered it to them, they would at least try it once. Probably if they went home and their mom did the same thing, they would be like, oh no, I don't like that. But because they had a hand in it and were enjoying the activity, then they would at least try it. A different activity that I would also throw in, depending on the grade level I had, was a science in your shopping cart activity. And this was where we just did some food science and we looked at different foods and how they were made and talked about different preservatives that can go into food just to make shelf life better for some things. I had students, I brought in a piece of cheese, just the Kraft singles. I brought in a piece of bread, and then we had an orange that we cut and peeled. And I asked the students to place it somewhere in our classroom, or in our school actually. So they went out to all different kinds of places in our school and they hid it. And they hid this among teachers' desk. We had one teacher whose desk is, as messy as mine, and I knew she would never find it. And they stuck a piece of cheese up under her desk. They left a note saying, if you find this, please don't throw it away. She never found it. We had them hiding them up inside ceiling tiles in different parts of the building. In one part of our school, we have what we call the old gym, and there are dressing rooms that we used to use underneath the bleachers. So we went down there and they hid stuff there. And they came back to the class a week later because it was just an afternoon STEM class. And they went and got their stuff. And they brought it back and we talked about what happened to each item. And we did this for a couple of weeks just so our students could see the difference in the different kinds of foods. And I had them predict what they thought would happen. Everyone thought that the cheese would mold and that the bread would mold first, I believe is what they said. But the cheese never molded. It got hard. I mean, it was hard and broke, just like this popsicle stick. The oranges molded first, and then the bread got hard first, and then in a couple of weeks when we went back, it had actually molded. So we talked about those different things, and we talked about why the singles cheese didn't mold and didn't just get really yucky looking, and why it got so hard. And now there's not singles in my refrigerator at home. We go for the American slices that are the deluxe kind and not wrapped in cellophane. And just talked about those different things and the different products that were used in different foods. In our town, we have Sweetwater Valley Farms just right next door. I don't know if you all have heard of that before, but they have a cheese plant there on site, and you can go and buy different kinds of cheeses and those kinds of things. And we talked about how some cheese is considered a delicacy when it does mold, and how people can just cut that mold off and they sell it for, very high prices because of that. And how convenience always doesn't mean it's the best product for our families. And just talked about the different things that go into food. And by doing those things, I found how many of my students had not tried just fresh foods before. In that activity, we also brought in fresh pineapple. And we talked about fresh pineapple versus canned pineapple. And every time I do this, I'm so surprised at how many of our students don't have those chances, have never tried those kinds of things before. So I think that just opens up different discussions we can have with our students. It opens up different, just different foods that they will try, and maybe find out a little bit more about those because we introduced it in the classroom. And like I said, these were after school activities that I was able to do with my students. I know Jennifer, who's going to talk later, she's going to connect all of these things to the standards that you're using in your classroom. That's hard for me to do since I teach 7th and 8th grade now, and I'm not as familiar with your all standards as I used to be. But she's going to connect all of those things for you this later on today when she's talking about the literacy components of the Ag in the Classroom program. A couple other things that I have, and one thing that we did this summer when we were doing live workshops is that we kind of placed everything in bags so each person could get an individual bag and not everyone's touching everything. So that is something that we could do if we're having to go virtually. I know in our county, we've talked about supplies and things like that with our students when they're participating virtually instead of in our classroom with us. And we've talked about, I had a meeting yesterday about our after school program, and they recommended, you know, bagging things up individually when we give those to our students. So this is kind of something that we did on our own for the workshops this summer, but you know, it's something that we'll be using when we actually go back to the classroom. And if we have to go virtually for the entire or a period of time, being able to get these things to our students. We have a catapult activity to do next. And I use this with my pumpkin unit that we do. Again, this is something that I can do with older kids, but also with younger kids, because I know many times you all go to pumpkin patches and things in the fall. I'm not sure how that's going to work this year either. I know in our school, all field trips have been canceled, and we're supposed to do virtual field trips this year, if we get to do any. But a catapult activity is something that you can connect with kids with. You can talk about the design process and using this with STEM. And you can bring in the Pumpkin Chunkin' TV show that I think is on Discovery or the History Channel or something like that. And you can ask students to design their own catapult. And what we did is we began with 2 of the bigger tongue depressors or craft sticks, whatever they're called now, and then 5 small ones. You have a plastic spoon and rubber bands to connect it all together with. And then you can make this a contest to see who could build the best catapult and who would be able to chunk their pumpkin the furthest. We used little pom-poms, or you can use marshmallows. We've used those before, which is probably not something you can use anymore because, you know, somebody's going to eat it. But you can put that together. I start by using a rubber band to connect my 2 big tongue depressors with. And then I put together the 5. They're going to be all together. And I think I'm supposed to have 4 rubber bands, but for some reason I ended up with 3. So I'll just kind of have to improvise here, because you're going to put your spoon on top of your big tongue depressors, and then you stick your 5 in between. Oops, I didn't connect my spoon. And then wedge that in there. And then you can have different contests with your students to see who can catapult their marshmallow or their pom-pom the furthest. You can ask them to design it different ways to see if they can get it to go further. But you can use this process to just talk about the pumpkin itself and just kind of open up discussion about what people can do with pumpkins. There's a pumpkin pie recipe. Sorry. Also in your ABC book, and it's a simple, it's quick pumpkin pie. And many kids who have not ever tried pumpkin pie will actually eat this pumpkin pie. It begins with a base of vanilla pudding, so it's going to taste very good. But you can talk about the different spices that people put into pumpkin to make it taste very sweet and very good. You can, pumpkins are something easy to grow. So even if you don't have a huge garden at your school, I mean, right now at my house, I have pumpkins growing from where I threw pumpkins out, you know, last year after we cut them up for jack-o'-lanterns. So it's something easy that you don't have to fool with a whole lot in order to get it to grow. You can use different sizes of pumpkins if you're doing a pumpkin unit. I've brought in great big pumpkins, little bitty ones, and you know, just some medium-sized ones. And we've done lots of predictions on which ones would float best, and talk about buoyancy, because they always think the little bitty pumpkin's going to float the best. And it doesn't. That great big one that you have, you can put it in a tub of water and it'll float all day. One year I cut the pumpkins open and they had to predict how many seeds were inside the pumpkin, which is pretty cool if you're doing that with 7th and 8th graders and you're watching them dig out the pumpkin guts and they're having to count seeds. They revert back to what you taught them, how they are putting things into groups and counting them by arrays and those kinds of things, instead of counting each one as they go, which is pretty fun. These things are just activities that you can do to bring more interest to your lesson and get your kids involved in what they are doing. Another favorite thing of mine to do is talk about bees. I know the Bee Man is another book that I've used a lot in my classroom. And again, Jennifer's going to talk about our literacy library and how you can get many of these books a little bit later today. But bees, to me, are very fascinating and probably the hardest working animals out there that you've ever, or insects, I guess, have dealt with. We hope to get bees for our school and have a couple of hives there. I know there are a couple of grants out there that you can work on to get those at school. I have several friends in our neighborhood who have started doing bees, and I've learned lots from them over watching them get started. I have a community member that will bring a beehive to our school. It's an exhibition hive. So he has that to where they can't get out. So our students feel very safe walking up and looking at the bees, and he has his queen marked, and he will let them come up and actually pick out the queen. And then he'll talk about the worker bees and how much they do and what they do for the hive itself. And I just find it fascinating. And we've talked about how you can make so much happen, and the pollination. A friend of mine keeps telling me he's going to bring me a couple of hives to put around my garden here at home, and how it would increase my production in my garden, even though it's not a huge garden, but he said it would probably double the amount of produce that I can get from my garden just by having those bees around. Right now, looking at all the tomatoes and zucchini I have sitting around my house, I'm not sure I want to double it, but it would be pretty cool to be able to do something like that and not increase the space that I'm using, but increase the produce that I am getting from my garden. And we have a small greenhouse at my school that I've been able to get funds for through Farm Bureau, a couple of community grants that I've used. We have a small greenhouse, and we have 3 raised beds. Typically this time of year, I have, lots of stuff going on at my school garden as well as my home garden. But with quarantine going on, I just didn't make it happen this year. Hopefully this fall we can get back with it and get things going in our school garden. Also, we have chickens at our school that I'm somehow in charge of too. So I've been at school just about every day over, since March, making sure that my chickens are fed and they have what they need. And we've had to do a little bit for them over the summer because it's been so hot and dry. Sunday afternoon, we spent the afternoon at school working on our coop, making sure they had plenty of shade and plenty of water and that kind of thing. We have 4 chickens at school. So between my chickens at school and my 1 chicken at home, we have lots of eggs going on, and we are able to use different activities about that during the school year. There's a magical vinegar egg activity that you can do with your students, and it's pretty simple. You put an egg in a jar of vinegar, and the acid in the vinegar is going to eat away at the shell of your egg, and eventually your egg will be very rubbery, and you can pull that egg out because you put it in there raw, and you pull the egg out and it's a rubbery egg now. We can put it in water, and we can watch it get bigger as it absorbs that water. But then you can also put it in syrup. Just put it in the white Karo syrup, and you can watch it shrink up because it's absorbing that sugar and that syrup inside the egg. I found that if you use a white store-bought egg in one jar, and then you put a farm fresh egg in another jar. My eggs I have Americana chickens, so they're kind of a greenish color, and you put that in there, you can see the eggshell dissolving as it happens, and versus the store-bought egg that's white, the shell is thinner, so it's going to happen quicker. But the farm fresh egg, if you've noticed, if you've had farm fresh eggs before and you try to boil them to do deviled eggs, they're not going to turn out as pretty because no matter how hard you try, that shell's really hard to come off because it is thicker. And you can just talk about how those things are different. And one year when we were on an Ag in the Classroom, the national conference, we went to an egg farm, an egg plant. We didn't get to see the chickens because as humans, we bring in different bacteria and different germs. So everyone who worked in that plant had to come in, change clothes, put booties on their shoes, hairnets on before they ever went into the chicken laying house. So we weren't allowed to do that because we were visitors, but we were able to see all of the eggs coming into the plant on the conveyor belts, and they talked about how strong the shells were. We learned that not all egg facilities have USD inspectors on site. You will see on different brands of eggs if they do or not. So that's something to watch for as you're grocery shopping. The one that we were at was an Eggland's Best plant, and they do have USDA inspectors. And if you notice on those eggs, there's a stamp on those saying that they are USDA inspected. But through this, you can learn so many things about the agriculture in our country and how different things are even in our country versus what's going on in Tennessee versus what's going on in, say, Colorado, which is where we were that year. We had gone to a corn maze facility also. They were doing agritourism. And we found out that in Colorado, you don't own the mineral rights to your land. And this particular farmer was not able to dig wells on his own land. On our farm, we have 4 different wells that, bring water to our homes, use at the dairy barn, and those kinds of things. And, we don't, yes, it's an expense to dig the well, but once you dug it, you're pretty much done except for maintenance. But he had to purchase water in order to irrigate his fields. And he had these ditches dug throughout his fields. And we were very curious as to what that was. And he said, well, I know when I can purchase water. They give me certain days and tell me when to open up my system. So when I open it up, I know I'm going to get the water to be able to irrigate my fields. And he said, the bad thing is I have an 8-foot water table on my farm, right over there in that next field. I know there's water 8 foot deep, which is something we don't have here. Our wells are 100 feet deep. But he said, I know I have that, but I can't use it just because of the different environmental laws and things in that state. So I find that fascinating when we are able to go on our national conferences to see how agriculture is so different in different parts of our country. So if you're ever able, if you're Farm Bureau or there is a White Reinhardt scholarship that I'm sure they'll talk about today that you can apply for that will get you to the national conference. But these conferences are really neat because it's activities that you learn about and that you can take home and use with your students. A lot of these things that you'll find in the ABC book and the things that we talk about today are things that you can find, at the dollar store to use with your students. Or you can get people to come in, and probably not this year because nobody gets to come in, but talk to your students about these different things. In your tub, you'll also find you'll have a farm volunteer book that you can use with your curriculum, and it will get you in touch with people who know more about these different topics than maybe you do about certain things. I know in East Tennessee, we know pretty much nothing about cotton. And that's something that I have tried to talk with my students about. I teach history, so I get to teach about the Civil War. And we talk about why cotton was so important at that time in different parts of our state. Many of my students, the only cotton they have ever seen is this cotton ball. And again, misconceptions about where this comes from, because many students will say, well, it comes from sheep. Because somewhere along the line in Vacation Bible School or Sunday school or something, they have taken the cotton and they glued the cotton ball onto a picture of a lamb. So they assume that this cotton is coming from sheep. This year in my classroom, I brought in cotton balls, and then I also got a cotton plant. We had a local farmer who did a very small field just to see what it would do in the East Tennessee clay dirt that we have. It grew, but not as much as it would have with better soil and better conditions. But I was able to get some cotton from him, and I passed it around with my students and, told them, feel the difference between the cotton ball and then the cotton plant. And we talked about finding the seeds in the cotton plant and having to remove the seed from the cotton plant itself before the invention of the cotton gin, and how difficult it was, because if you just tear it apart any old way, then you're going to be losing a lot of the cotton, which is where people were making their money, and how you want to be able to separate it from the seed in order to be able to plant the next year. But being able to see and touch that, even as 8th graders, was something that they will remember. And even, I think my principal or vice principal, one of them, was in the room that day. And they had never actually been able to touch and feel an actual cotton plant, just because it's not something that we have in East Tennessee, where we see things growing all the time. So just being able to show these things to our students gives them a better understanding of where these things come from. And like I said, I was able to find it locally. Many of the things that we talk about today, you're going to be able to find and get very easily through Ag in the Classroom and through Tennessee Farm Bureau or even American Farm Bureau. There'll be different ways that you can get those things and different websites that you can use. We'll talk about the different commodities of Tennessee, and each commodity group typically has very good websites and resources that teachers can use in their classroom, and just being able to connect those things with our students. My school is in a very rural area. And I always have those farm kids who would much rather be outside. They will go outside and pull weeds in my garden, all day long if I make them, give them something to do rather than write an essay about American history. But it's just a way to connect with kids and show them different things and different ways to do those things. And I feel like it makes my kids appreciate what we have a little bit more, and hopefully learn to take care of what we have and be able to feed those however many people Chris was talking about with our apple earlier today. If we don't have that and aren't able to do that, then we're going to be in a world of hurt. And we need to appreciate those farmers who are out there doing it every day and feeding their families and feeding us. I believe we are going to take about a 15-minute break. And then Beverly is going to come on and do some more things with you. I've lost her. I don't know where she went. But if we will, oh, hold on. She's sending me a message. So there she is. She's waving at us. We'll take about a 15-minute break and we'll come back and we will let Beverly take over.